He packed a bag on a Wednesday morning and didn't tell me where he was going. Not a suitcase. Just a bag. The kind you grab when you don't know how long you'll be gone, but you're not ready to admit that out loud yet. I watched him from the bedroom doorway, still holding my coffee with both hands, and I didn't say a word. Because what was I supposed to say? I knew exactly why he was leaving. I had been watching this moment come toward me for 8 months, like a slow-moving storm. I kept telling myself would change direction. It didn't change direction, it came straight through us. My name is Willa Beckett. I'm 27 years old. I work as an interior stylist in Phoenix, Arizona. And I am the person who took a perfectly good relationship and quietly dismantled it from the inside. Not out of cruelty, not out of selfishness, but out of a loyalty that I let grow so large, it left no room for the person who actually chose me every single day. If you're new here, please take 2 seconds to like this video and subscribe. It literally takes 2 seconds, and I need your support more than I can explain right now. Stay until the end of this. I promise it goes somewhere you won't expect. Nash and I met when I was 24. He came into the showroom where I was working at the time to pick up a chair his mother had ordered. And he was 45 minutes late, and genuinely mortified about it. He apologized to every single person in the room, including the delivery guy who had nothing to do with anything. That was the first thing I noticed about him. The way he moved through the world like other people's time actually mattered. I fell for that before I even knew his last name. 3 years! That's what we built. 3 years of him showing up to my client installs with food because he knew I forgot to eat on big days. 3 years of him learning the difference between warm white and cool white lighting because I talked about it too much. 3 years of him being the steadiest, most unshakable presence I have ever had in my life, and I repaid that by handing our future over to someone else, without even realizing that's what I was doing. The conversation happened on a Sunday evening in October. We were making dinner, nothing special, just pasta and whatever vegetables were about to go bad in the fridge. Nash turned down the stove and said he wanted to talk about something. I remember noticing he'd already set his wooden spoon down before he started speaking, which meant he'd been thinking about this for a while. Nash doesn't put things down until he's ready to be fully present for them. He said he'd been thinking about timing, about marriage, about kids, about what our future actually looked like, with real dates attached to it instead of just the abstract idea of someday. He said he wanted to be the kind of dad who could still kick a ball around at 50, who could take a camping trip without his knees giving out, who was present in the physical way that actually matters to kids. He wasn't pressuring me. He wasn't giving me an ultimatum. He was just being honest the way he always is. Quiet and direct and completely without drama. I told him I wanted all of that too. And I meant it. Every word. But then I said, there's just one thing. And I watched something shift behind his eyes before I even finished the sentence. I told him about Prue. Prue Davenport has been my best friend since we were college roommates at 19. She is the kind of person who has shown up for every hard moment of my adult life without being asked. She drove 4 hours when my dad had his health scare. She sat with me on my bathroom floor the night a client threatened to sue me over a design dispute. She has never once made me feel like my problems were inconvenient. Our friendship is one of the most important things in my life, and I am not ashamed of that. But here's what I told Nash that Sunday, and here is the part I have had to sit with every day since. I told him I wanted us to get married around the same time as Prue. Not the same day. Not even the same venue. Just the same season. The same chapter of life. Because we had talked about it since we were 20. And it had become this quiet little dream we both held on to. I thought Nash would understand. I thought he would think it was sweet. Instead, he was very still for a long moment. And then he said, "Okay, but Prue isn't even dating anyone right now, is she?" And that was the part I hadn't fully thought through when I opened my mouth. Because Prue wasn't just single. Prue had been single for almost 2 years. Prue had also, in her own words, sworn off the idea of marriage after watching her parents go through a brutal divorce the previous spring. She wasn't actively looking. She wasn't even sure she believed in it anymore. And I had just told the man who wanted to build a life with me that our wedding timeline was dependent on a woman who wasn't sure she wanted one at all. Nash didn't yell. He didn't storm off. He just nodded slowly and said, "So what does that mean for us practically, Willa?" And I didn't have an answer. I sat there with my pasta going cold and my mouth slightly open and absolutely nothing useful coming out of it. That was 8 months ago, and everything that has happened since has brought us to a Wednesday morning, a packed bag by the front door, and a silence so heavy I could feel it pressing against my chest from across the hallway. I should have seen what was coming. Looking back now, every sign was there, but I was so convinced that Prue would come around, that love would sort itself out on its schedule, that Nash would wait because he loved me, that I missed every single warning this relationship tried to give me. If you've ever watched yourself make a mistake in slow motion and still couldn't stop it, stay with me, because this story is about exactly that. The first few weeks after that conversation, Nash didn't bring it up again, and I mistook his silence for acceptance. That was my first real mistake. Not the promise itself, but the assumption that because he hadn't pushed back harder, he had quietly made peace with it. Nash is not a man who makes scenes. He processes internally, he weighs things carefully, and he comes back when he's ready. I knew this about him. I had 3 years of evidence of exactly this pattern, and still I told myself his silence meant agreement, instead of what it actually meant, which was that he was trying to decide how much this was going to cost him. I threw myself into work that month. I had 3 back-to-back staging projects and a new client who wanted a full home refresh before the holidays, which meant 12-hour days and weekends on site. Nash was supportive the way he always was. No complaints, dinner ready when I got home on the nights he wasn't working late himself, back rubs when I said my shoulders hurt without me having to ask twice. On the surface, everything looked fine. It felt fine. I started to relax, and then Prue came over for dinner on a Friday night in November, and everything quietly shifted. It wasn't anything dramatic. She wasn't rude to Nash, he wasn't cold to her. It was the small things. The way Nash asked her about her dating life with just a little too much careful neutrality. Not curious, not warm, just precise. The way Prue laughed it off and said she was happily retired from the whole circus. And Nash smiled and nodded, and then excused himself to get more wine, and stayed in the kitchen just slightly too long. I noticed all of it. I notice everything. It's both the best and worst thing about me. I can read a room down to the temperature, but sometimes knowing doesn't help you do anything about what you know. After Prue left that night, Nash washed the dishes and I dried them, and neither of us spoke for a while. Then he said, "She seems happy." I said, "She is." He said, "That's good." And then nothing. Just the sound of water and plates and the hum of the refrigerator. But the nothing felt loaded in a way I couldn't shake. I started paying closer attention after that. Not in a paranoid way, more like the way you turn up the volume on something that started playing at the edge of your hearing. I watched how Nash engaged with conversations about the future. When his coworker announced a pregnancy at a team dinner we attended together in December, I watched Nash's face instead of looking at the photo being passed around. He smiled. He congratulated them. And then he glanced at me for just a half second with an expression I couldn't quite name. Not sad, not accusatory, just searching. Like he was checking to see if I was tracking what he was feeling. I looked away too fast. I wasn't ready to meet it. The thing about Nash is that he had never once pressured me in 3 years. Not about moving in together, not about the future, not about any of it. He let things develop at a pace that felt right to both of us. So when he had finally, after all that patience, brought up marriage in October, that hadn't been impulsive. That had been deliberate. That had been him deciding he was ready and trusting me enough to say so out loud. And what I had done in response was tell him I was ready too, just not on any timeline we could actually control. I think about that a lot now, the trust it took for him to say what he said. and what I handed back to him. In January, he mentioned offhand that his lease on the car was coming up for renewal, and he was thinking about switching to something with more cargo space. I got excited immediately. I started listing all the road trips we could finally take with the dogs we had been talking about getting, the camping gear, the weekend market runs. He listened with a small smile and said, "Yeah, maybe." And I didn't catch the shift in that maybe until much later. At the time, it just sounded like casual agreement. In hindsight, it sounded like a man who wasn't sure he was still planning for two. Prue and I had coffee in February, and I told her all of it. Not because I thought she could fix anything, but because she's the person I tell everything to, and I needed to say it out loud to someone who wasn't Nash. I told her about the October conversation, about the timeline condition, about the way things had felt slightly off-center ever since, in a way I couldn't fully articulate. Prue was quiet for a long moment. She wrapped both hands around her mug the way she does when she's about to say something she's not sure you want to hear. She said, "Willa, you tied your relationship to my love life." I said, "I know." She said, "That's not fair to him." I said, "I know." She said, "And, honestly, it's not fair to me either. I'm not a timeline. I'm a person." I didn't have an answer for that. I just looked at my coffee and felt something cold move through my chest because she was right. And I already knew she was right, and knowing it didn't change the fact that 8 months earlier, I had sat in my kitchen and said what I said, and Nash had been quietly carrying it ever since. The next morning I woke up, and Nash was already gone for a run. He left a note on the counter. "Just the coffee is fresh," with a small arrow pointing to the pot, the way he always did. I stood there, reading those 3 words, and thinking about how much care lived in something that small. How much of our entire relationship lived in gestures that small. And I thought, what if he stops leaving notes? I told myself I was being dramatic. I made my coffee and opened my laptop and got to work. But something about that morning sat with me for the rest of the day. Like a door I had walked past 100 times, had finally caught my attention, and I wasn't sure I was ready to open it and see what was on the other side. The false resolution came in March, and I almost believed it. Nash suggested we take a long weekend trip to Sedona, just the 2 of us. No work talk, no heavy conversations, just red rocks and good food and uninterrupted time. I said yes before he finished the sentence. We drove up on a Thursday morning with the windows down and a playlist he had made the night before, and for approximately 48 hours, everything felt like it used to. We hiked. We found a tiny restaurant with handmade pasta and ate outside under string lights. We laughed about nothing, in the way you can only laugh when you're completely relaxed inside a relationship. I fell asleep on his shoulder in the car on the way back Sunday night, and remember thinking, we're okay. We're actually okay. I should have known that the trip was not a resolution. It was Nash giving us one more beautiful thing before he made a decision. I found out in April what that decision was starting to look like. His friend Donovan was in town for a work conference, and Nash went to meet him for drinks on a Thursday evening. I stayed home, finished a client mood board, went to bed early. Nash came home around 11, not drunk, just loose and warm the way he gets after a few hours with someone he genuinely likes. I was half asleep, but I heard him moving around the bedroom, heard him set his phone on the charger, heard him sit on the edge of the bed. He said, "You awake?" I said, "Barely." He was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "Donovan asked how things were with us." I said, "What did you tell him?" He said, "I told him we were good." And then he didn't say anything else, just lay down and pulled the blanket up. But the way he said it, "We were good," past tense, with a very slight pause before it, wrapped around something he wasn't ready to hand me yet. I was wide awake the second those words hit the air. I lay there for a long time in the dark, listening to him breathe and thinking about verb tenses. We were good. Not we are good. Not we're great. Were. One small letter. Past tense. And Nash chooses his words with the precision of someone who edits before he speaks. He doesn't slip everything he says is what he means. I didn't bring it up the next morning. I wasn't ready for what might come out of that conversation. So I made breakfast and we talked about nothing, and he kissed me before he left for work, and I stood in the kitchen after the door closed and stared at the counter for a long time. 2 weeks later, I found the apartment listing. I had grabbed his laptop to look something up while mine was updating, and his last browser tab was a rental search, filtered to one-bedroom units, sorted by price, with one listing saved. $1,100 a month. A building 12 minutes from his office. New appliances, in-unit laundry, available June 1st. He had added a note in the saved tab. Just the word, viable. Viable. I sat down on the couch, still holding the laptop, and read that word 6 times. Viable. Not maybe, or check this out, or for reference. Viable. The word of someone who has already started problem solving. The word of someone who has started quietly doing the math on a life without me in it. I closed the tab. I closed the laptop. I put it back exactly where it had been, and then I went and stood in the bathroom with the door closed for about 10 minutes just breathing. This is the part I keep coming back to. I wasn't even angry. I know that sounds strange, but what I felt standing in that bathroom wasn't betrayal or rage. It was grief. Pure, heavy, already arriving grief, the kind that shows up before the actual loss, because your nervous system knows what's coming before your brain is willing to say it. I called Prue from my car in the parking garage of a client building later that afternoon. I didn't tell her about the listing. I just said, "I think Nash is thinking about leaving." And she went very quiet and then said, "Willa, what do you want to do?" And that was the first time anyone had asked me that. Not what did Nash want, not what did the promise require, not what was fair to Prue. What did I want? And I sat there in my parked car in a concrete garage and realized I had been so consumed with managing the situation that I had completely stopped asking myself that question. What I wanted was Nash. Just Nash, a man who refilled water glasses and picked cilantro out of shared dishes and left coffee notes and drove to Sedona to give us one more good weekend before he ran out of them. I wanted to undo October. I wanted to take back those words the second they left my mouth. I wanted to have just said yes, a simple, unqualified, unconditional yes when he asked me about the future, but I hadn't. And now we were here. And the question wasn't what I wished I had done. The question was what I was going to do now, with the information I had, before June 1st arrived, and that one bedroom became his answer. The ticking clock I had ignored for 8 months suddenly felt very loud. I didn't confront Nash about the apartment listing. Not immediately, because I knew that if I walked in hot, led with the fact that I'd seen it, made him feel cornered, I would lose him that night instead of in June. And that was not what I wanted. What I wanted was a real conversation. The kind we hadn't had since October. The kind where both of us were fully present and honest, and not performing okay for each other's benefit. So I gave myself 3 days. 3 days to think clearly, to figure out what I actually wanted to say, to stop reacting from panic and start responding from something steadier. I used those 3 days well. The first thing I did was call Prue back and tell her everything. The listing, the word viable, the Sedona trip I now understood differently, the verb tense on a Saturday night when Nash said we were good instead of we are good. I told her all of it. And Prue, to her absolute credit, did not make it about herself. She listened without interrupting, and when I finished, she said, "You already know what you need to do." I said, "I need to take the condition back." She said, "Yes. And you need to mean it." I said, "I do mean it. I should never have said it." She said, "Then tell him that." Not a version of it. Not, "I've been thinking about what I said." All of it. The apartment, what you felt, what you want. He deserves the full version. She was right. She is almost always right about things that matter, which is part of why I love her, and part of why I had made such a catastrophic error in judgment by wrapping our futures together without asking her permission. The second thing I did was write it down. Not a script. I wasn't going to read from paper, but I needed to organize what I was feeling into something I could actually say out loud without falling apart. I sat at my desk on a Friday night and wrote for almost 2 hours. All of it. The October conversation. The moment I said, "There's just one thing," and watched his face shift. The months of watching him quietly recalibrate. The Sedona weekend I now understood as a farewell gift he wasn't sure he was ready to give yet. The listing, viable. The parking garage phone call. The grief that arrived before the loss. I also wrote the part I was most ashamed of. That I had known, somewhere deep and quiet, for months, that I was losing him. And I had kept adjusting small things. Making his favorite dinners more often, being more affectionate, finding little ways to create warmth, without ever addressing the actual problem. I had been patching a wall I hadn't told him was cracking. And that wasn't love, that was management. And Nash deserved better than being managed. On Saturday morning, he made pancakes. He always made pancakes on weekend mornings when he didn't have anywhere to be. Another one of those small constants I had taken entirely for granted. I sat at the kitchen island watching him and waiting for the right moment. And then I said his name, and something in my tone must have landed differently because he turned around and looked at me with full attention before I had even said the next word. I said, "I need to tell you something, and I need you to just let me get through it before you respond." He nodded. He set down the spatula. I told him I had seen the listing. I told him I had seen the word viable, and I understood what it meant, and I wasn't angry. I was scared. And I was sorry. I told him that what I said in October was wrong. Not wrong in a "I misspoke" way, wrong in a fundamental way, wrong in a way that said more about my fear of change than my love for him, wrong in a way that handed our future to a condition neither of us could control and called it loyalty when really, it was avoidance. I told him I didn't want to get married around the same time as Prue. I wanted to get married when we were ready, which we already were, which we had been for longer than I was willing to admit. I told him I wanted him. Specifically him, on a timeline that belonged only to us. Nash stood on the other side of the kitchen island and listened to all of it without moving. When I finished, he was quiet for long enough that I had to physically resist the urge to fill the silence with more words. Then he said, "Why are you telling me this now?" Not angry, just precise. Nash is always precise. I said, "Because I found the listing 3 weeks ago and I spent 3 weeks trying to find the courage." He said, 3 weeks. I said, "I know." He looked at the stove for a moment, then back at me. Then he said, "Willa, I have been trying to give you time to come to this on your own. I didn't want to force it. I didn't want to be the person who made you feel pressured into something you weren't ready for." I said, "I was ready. I was just scared." He said, "Scared of what?" I said, "Of losing Prue. Of being the first one to move into the next chapter and leaving her behind in a life that already hurt her." It felt like abandonment, even though I know that doesn't make sense. Something moved across his face when I said that. Not softness exactly, more like recognition, like a piece of the last 8 months had just clicked into a shape he could finally understand. He picked the spatula back up. The pancakes were slightly overdone on one side. He flipped them anyway. And then, without turning around, he said, "I haven't paid a deposit on anything." I let out a breath I had been holding for 3 weeks. But he also said, "That doesn't mean we're back to normal, Willa. I need you to understand that." He turned around then. "I need to know this is actually different, not just because you saw the listing. Because you actually changed something in how you're thinking about us." I nodded. I meant it. I had changed something. I could feel it. The shift that happens when you finally stop negotiating with your own fear and just decide. But I also knew that deciding wasn't enough. Nash needed to see it. And showing someone something real takes longer than a Saturday morning conversation over slightly burnt pancakes. He didn't move out. But he also didn't immediately move back in, emotionally. And I want to be honest about that because I think the messy middle is the part that actually matters. The 2 weeks after that kitchen conversation were strange and careful. We were kind to each other, but there was a new quality to the kindness, more deliberate, less automatic, like we were both being thoughtful in a way that wasn't quite natural yet, hadn't resettled into the ease we used to have. Nash was present but slightly measured. I was trying not to overcompensate with gestures that would feel like performance. We were both, I think, trying to figure out if trust could grow back in the same shape it had been before, or if it would have to grow back in a different shape entirely. Prue was the unexpected piece of all of it. I had told her about the kitchen conversation that same Saturday afternoon, and she had been genuinely relieved. But then she said something I wasn't expecting. She said, "I need to tell you something too." She said she had actually been in therapy for the past 3 months, working through her feelings about marriage and her parents, divorce, and what she actually wanted versus what she had convinced herself she wanted. She said she wasn't ready to say she believed in marriage again, but she was starting to believe she didn't have to make a permanent decision at 27 about something she was still healing from. She said she had been afraid to tell me because she didn't want to accidentally give me false hope that she was heading somewhere she wasn't sure she was heading yet. I sat with that for a long time. Prue had been carrying her own quietly shifting thing this whole time, just like Nash, just like me. We had all been moving in our own directions without telling each other the full picture, and I had built a condition around an assumption about someone else's life that I had never actually verified. That was the part that stung most when I finally saw it clearly. Not that I had made a mistake, but that the mistake was built on a foundation of things I had assumed instead of things I had asked. The conversation Nash and I had that actually turned the corner happened on a Wednesday evening about 3 weeks after the pancake morning. Not dramatic, not planned. He came home from work and said he'd had a hard day, and I made tea, and we sat on the couch and talked for 2 hours. About nothing important at first, and then about everything important. He told me that the Sedona trip had been him trying to hold on, that he had been closer to leaving than I probably knew, that the listing had been real, in a way he hadn't been ready to admit to himself either. He said, "I didn't want to leave, I just couldn't see how to stay." I said, "And now?" He said, "Now I can see it again." That sentence. 4 words. I have turned them over in my mind almost every day since he said them, because of what they cost him to get to. Nash is not a man who gives up easily, but he is also not a man who stays somewhere that isn't working out of stubbornness. The fact that he could still see a way to stay, after everything, after 8 months of quietly carrying something I had handed him without understanding the weight of it, that was not something I took lightly. That was something I decided, in that moment, I would spend a long time being worthy of. We didn't get engaged that night. I want to be clear about that because I think the honest version of this story doesn't end with a ring and a ribbon. What happened was quieter, and in some ways more meaningful. Nash took the listing out of his saved tabs and told me about it, and we both understood what that meant without needing to make it bigger than it was. He didn't make it a grand gesture. He just said, "I closed that tab," and looked at me steadily, and I nodded, and that was enough. Sometimes, enough is everything. A few days later he brought home a plant. A big fiddle-leaf fig for the corner of the living room that we had talked about filling since we moved in together. He set it down and adjusted it twice to get the light right, and then stepped back and said, "I figured we should finally do something about that corner." And I laughed. Genuinely, fully. The kind of laugh that happens when relief and love arrive at exactly the same time, and your body doesn't know which one to lead with. That plant is still alive. I check it every morning. It has become this quiet, private thing between us. Proof that we are still building something together. Still adding to the space we share. Still choosing each other in the small ways that outlast every hard conversations. Some mornings, Nash waters it before I'm even out of bed and leaves the little watering can on the windowsill where I can see it. It sounds like nothing. It is everything. I am not going to pretend the last 8 months didn't happen, or that we are exactly where we would have been if I had simply said yes in October without conditions. Something shifted, and it will take time to fully settle. But we are settling it together, which is the only version of it that ever mattered to me. What I want you to take from this, if there is anything worth taking, is that the condition I placed on our future was never really about Prue. It was about fear. Fear of changing. Fear of being the one who moved into a new chapter first. Fear of a future that felt too big to step into, even though I had never once been asked to step into it alone. Nash had been there the whole time. Prue was going to find her own way regardless of what chapter I was in. The only thing standing between me and the life I actually wanted was a fear I had dressed up in the language of loyalty, so I didn't have to look at it directly. Look at it directly. Whatever version of it lives in your life, look at it, name it, stop managing around it, and start telling the truth about it to the person who deserves to hear it most. If this story landed somewhere real for you, please leave a comment below. I read every single one and they mean more than I can say. Like this video if you made it to the end. Share it with someone who needs to hear it today. And subscribe if you want to stay. I am so grateful you were here for this one.